is unparalleled in the world in terms of wealth underground. For example, the water table, the most significant water table in the world, goes from Mauritania to Somalia and goes through Mali, Algeria, Libya, Niger, etc. The newspaper Le Monde in July 1957 put forth the figure of 6 to 7 million tons of oil found below our soil, potentially in the Sahara, in addition to the natural resources that we also have, such as uranium, gold, cobalt, zinc, diamonds, lithium, copper, etc. You, the Westerners, you so much love the Sahel people, so much that you bring your military and your armies to die in the name of democracy, in the name of freedom and human rights and peace. Then why is it that an African continent with some 1.3 billion people, and the second largest continent of the world in terms of people, with a number that the interpreter cannot figure out of the number of square kilometers, and 54 states, has no permanent seat within the Security Council? Such a huge continent with so many people.
Can African leaders challenge the West on global platforms? While the West has a reputation for confronting nations regardless of wrongdoing, few nations have held them accountable for obvious reasons. It's the power they wield over each nation that keeps leaders silent. But Africa is changing this narrative. It's breaking free from Western dominance and gearing up to confront it. Burkina Faso's Minister of Civil Service, Basolma Bazi, recently articulated Africa's struggles because of the West at the United Nations General Assembly. Yet how will the West respond? Will they take action against Bazi? Let's find out. No more condescension, no more exploitation. Africa will rise on its terms, declared Burkina Faso's Minister of Civil Service, Basolma Bazi, during a fiery address at the United Nations General Assembly. This statement encapsulates the bold rebuke delivered by Burkina Faso's new government under military leader Ibrahim Traore, targeting Western powers for their historical and ongoing interventions in African affairs. The speech, marked by its unapologetic critique of Western policies and practices, resonated deeply within the UN and reverberated across Africa, capturing the international community's attention. Bazi's criticized Western nations' historical exploitations, particularly France's, and emphasized Africa's significant contributions to global history and the vast natural resources that have long been a point of contention. By invoking the sacrifices of African soldiers during World War II and highlighting the continued presence of foreign military forces in the Sahel, Bazi questioned the true intentions behind Western involvement in Africa. Let's do an overview of the speech. In a significant address at the United Nations General Assembly, Basolma Bazi, Burkina Faso's Minister of Civil Service, delivered a speech that captured global attention for its bold criticism of Western interventions and its call for African empowerment. Representing the government led by military leader Ibrahim Traore, Bazi's speech was a clarion call for re-evaluating international relations and a demand for a more equitable and respectful engagement between Africa and the West. At the core of Bazi's address was a fearless denunciation of Western policies towards Africa, focusing on France. Bazi accused French President Emmanuel Macron of condescension and hypocrisy, arguing that Western countries have long engaged in exploitative practices under the guise of aid and development. This critique extended to the broader Western approach to African nations, which Bazi described as paternalistic and self-serving. Ibrahim Traore, Burkina Faso's military leader, has been gaining significant support across Africa, largely due to his courageous stance against Western and puppet African leaders. Traore's popularity stems from a growing Pan-African sentiment that calls for a break from neo-colonial influences and a move towards genuine independence and self-reliance. Bazi's speech at the UN reflected Traore's vision, resonating with many Africans who see him as a champion of their interests. In his address, Bazi did not mince words when addressing the historical and ongoing injustices faced by African nations. He specifically targeted President Macron, accusing him of speaking down to African leaders and failing to acknowledge the deep-rooted issues caused by centuries of exploitation. This part of the speech was particularly poignant, as Bazi highlighted the stark contrast between Macron's public statements on partnership and the reality of continued economic and political dominance. Bazi's speech took a historical turn as he reminded the international community of Africa's crucial role in global events, particularly during World War II. He pointed out that African soldiers, including 177,000 Malians, fought and died to save France from Nazi occupation. This historical reminder highlighted the deep and often overlooked sacrifices made by Africans, emphasizing that the contributions of African nations have been indispensable yet consistently undervalued. Had he something to say about France? Building on the theme of historical injustice, Bazi referenced France's colonial history and the exploitation of African resources and labor. He cited acknowledgments by past French presidents of the economic benefits France derived from its African colonies. This exploitation, Bazi argued, has had lasting effects, contributing to the current socio-economic challenges faced by many African countries. By highlighting these points, Bazi aimed to challenge the narrative of benevolent Western assistance, revealing it as a continuation of exploitative practices. One of the most compelling aspects of Bazi's speech was his emphasis on Africa's vast natural resources. He listed uranium, gold, cobalt, zinc, diamonds, lithium, and copper as some of the continent's riches, questioning why, despite this wealth, African countries remain economically disadvantaged. This paradox, Bazi suggested, is due to the ongoing exploitation and mismanagement of these resources by Western corporations and governments, often in collusion with corrupt local elites. Bazi also addressed the significant presence of foreign military forces in Africa, particularly in the Sahel region. He criticized the deployment of 10,000 foreign soldiers, mostly from Western countries, for their ineffectiveness in combating terrorism. Instead, he raised suspicions about their true intentions, suggesting that these forces might be more interested in securing access to Africa's resources than providing genuine security. This critique resonates with many Africans who view the foreign military presence as an extension of colonial control rather than a partnership for peace. A major point of contention in Bazi's speech was the lack of African representation in the UN Security Council. He criticized the absence of a permanent seat and veto power for Africa, despite the continent's large population and significant land area. This imbalance in global governance structures, Bazi argued, perpetuates a system where African voices are marginalized in critical international decisions. He called for restructuring the Security Council to reflect the realities of the modern world and ensure that African nations have a say in matters that affect them directly. Here's a reminder to please like and share the video and subscribe to our channel to watch more videos on Black culture, history, civilization, and identity. Let's continue now. Bazi's address also touched on cultural issues, urging African leaders to reclaim their cultural identity and resist Western impositions. He specifically mentioned the rejection of homosexuality, framing it as a Western cultural imposition alien to African traditions. This call for cultural reclamation is part of a broader effort to assert African values and resist Western cultural domination. The speech highlighted the glaring disparities between Western investments in military and nuclear power and the minimal aid received by African nations. Bazi pointed out that while the West spends billions on military actions, the aid provided to Africa is a fraction of what is needed to address the continent's development challenges. This inequity reflects misplaced priorities and a lack of genuine commitment to global justice. What about international organizations? Did he forget the role international organizations played? Bazi did not spare international organizations in his critique, condemning the Western domination of bodies like the UN Security Council, World Trade Organization, and World Health Organization. He argued that these organizations are often tools of Western interests, failing to represent the needs and perspectives of the global South. This part of the speech was a call for reform, advocating for a more inclusive and equitable international system. Throughout his speech, Bazi emphasized the need for African nations to fight for true emancipation, social progress, and better governance. He called for addressing the root causes of instability and coup, which he linked to external interference and internal corruption. Bazi's vision is one of Africa's being self-reliant, united, and capable of charting its path without undue influence from external powers. What reaction did this speech get? The bold speech by Burkina Faso's Minister of Civil Service, Basolma Bazi, at the United Nations General Assembly stirred many immediate reactions from around the globe. These reactions varied significantly. reflecting various stakeholders' diverse perspectives and interests, from Western governments to African nations, international organizations, and media outlets. The speech's pointed criticisms were met with mixed reactions from Western governments. French President Emmanuel Macron, who Bazy directly called out, responded with a blend of defensiveness and diplomatic rhetoric. Macron insisted that France's intentions in Africa have always been to support stability and development, emphasizing ongoing efforts to combat terrorism in the Sahel and provide humanitarian aid. However, behind closed doors, there were reportedly more candid discussions about the growing anti-French sentiment in West Africa and the need to recalibrate France's approach to the continent. Other Western nations, including the United States and the United Kingdom, offered more measured responses. Officials from these countries acknowledged some of Bazy's points, particularly historical exploitation and the need for more equitable partnerships. A spokesperson for the U.S. State Department mentioned that the speech highlighted valid concerns that need to be addressed through stronger and fairer international cooperation. However, they also emphasized the importance of maintaining regional security partnerships to combat extremist threats. How do Africans react to this? Across Africa, the speech was overwhelmingly well received, sparking a wave of support for Ibrahim Traore and his government's forthright stance. Many African leaders expressed solidarity with the themes of the speech, which resonated deeply with their own experiences of Western dominance and exploitation. The African Union AU released a statement praising Burkina Faso for voicing African nations' collective frustrations and aspirations. The AU's statement highlighted the need for structural reforms in international bodies to better represent African interests. In countries like Mali, Niger, and Guinea, where similar sentiments against Western intervention have been growing, the speech was seen as a rallying cry for greater unity and self-reliance among African states. These countries, many of which have also experienced military coups and political instability, found in Bazy's speech a validation of their struggles and a call to action to reclaim their sovereignty and dignity. And what do international organizations have to say about it? International organizations had a more cautious but constructive reaction to Bazy's speech. The United Nations itself, while traditionally a platform for diplomatic decorum, recognized the significance of the issues raised. The UN Secretary-General acknowledged the grievances articulated by Burkina Faso's representative and called for renewed efforts to address the systemic inequities within the UN structures, including the Security Council. There was a consensus within the UN that the lack of African representation on the Security Council is an issue that needs urgent attention. The World Trade Organization (WTO) and the World Health Organization (WHO) also responded to the criticisms. The WTO acknowledged that trade policies have often favored developed nations and committed to working towards fairer trade agreements that benefit African countries. On its part, the WHO reiterated its commitment to health equity and pledged to increase support for health systems in African nations. Media coverage of the speech varied widely, reflecting the geopolitical biases and interests of different regions. African media outlets were largely supportive, with many praising Bazy's courage and the clarity of his message. Newspapers and television channels across the continent highlighted the historical references to Africa's contributions during World War II and the exploitation of its resources, framing these as crucial reminders of Africa's undervalued role in global history. In contrast, Western media took a more divided approach. Some outlets, particularly those with a more progressive editorial stance, recognized the legitimacy of Bazy's criticisms and called for a re-examination of Western policies toward Africa. For instance, The Guardian published an editorial urging Western nations to listen to African voices and address the historical injustices that continue to shape current relationships. Other Western media, however, were more defensive. Conservative outlets like Fox News and some segments of the French press focused on the perceived ungratefulness of African leaders, arguing that Western aid and military support are crucial for the stability and development of the continent. These outlets tended to downplay the historical context provided by Bazy and emphasize the narrative of Western benevolence. Now, the question is what experts have to say about this speech. Political analysts and scholars provided various insights into the implications of Bazy's speech. Experts in African politics praised the speech for its boldness and historical grounding. a prominent African political scientist, noted that Bazi's references to World War II and the sacrifices of African soldiers were powerful reminders of the debt owed by Western nations to Africa. She argued that such speeches must challenge the dominant narratives and push for a more just global order. While acknowledging the validity of some criticisms, Western experts cautioned against a wholesale rejection of Western engagement. Professor John Campbell, a senior fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, highlighted the complexity of Western African relations, arguing that both sides need to work towards building more equitable partnerships rather than disengaging altogether. And what public reaction was seen? Public reactions mirrored the official and media responses, with social media platforms buzzing with discussions about the speech. In the West, social media reactions were mixed. Many users, particularly from African diaspora communities, supported Bazi's message, while others echoed the defensive stance in some media outlets. The speech also sparked debates about the role of historical memory and the need for reparative justice. Now you must be thinking, what would this impact on the relations between Africa and the West? Will the West mind it? Bazi's speech has triggered a seismic shift in Burkina Faso's diplomatic landscape, sending uncertainty across the international community, especially among Western nations. The immediate aftermath is marked by a sense of urgency and the need for recalibration in diplomatic relations, particularly between Burkina Faso and its former colonial power, France. Historically entwined with its former African colonies, France now finds itself at a crossroads, compelled to reassess its traditional approach to diplomacy in the region. Bazi's speech has catalyzed a surge in anti-French sentiments within Burkina Faso and beyond, reflecting broader sentiments of resentment and calls for greater autonomy among African nations. For France, this signifies a pressing need to navigate a more delicate diplomatic terrain that acknowledges the shifting dynamics of power and agency in post-colonial Africa. The traditional paternalistic approach will no longer suffice as African nations increasingly assert their sovereignty and demand equitable treatment in diplomatic dealings. Observing these developments, Western governments are compelled to adjust their strategies and engagements with African nations. The era of unilateral decision-making and the imposition of Western interests is giving way to a more nuanced and balanced approach that acknowledges African nations' agency and aspirations. Diplomatic dialogues and negotiations will likely intensify in the coming months as Western nations seek to balance their strategic interests with the growing demands of African nations for equitable treaty sovereignty. This recalibration period promises challenges and opportunities for fostering more mutually beneficial diplomatic relations between Burkina Faso, other African nations, and the Western world. Many people wonder why Africa did this. Why is there a change in Africa? The speech by Burkina Faso's Minister of Civil Service, Basolma Bazi, at the United Nations General Assembly must be understood within the broader context of contemporary geopolitical dynamics, particularly the shifting power relations in Africa and the evolving nature of international engagements on the continent. In recent years, there has been a marked increase in anti-colonial and anti-imperialist sentiment across Africa. This sentiment is rooted in the historical exploitation and ongoing economic powers. Countries like Burkina Faso, under the leadership of figures like Ibrahim Traore, have become vocal advocates for a new path of self-determination and sovereignty. This resurgence of Pan-Africanism echoes the movements of the mid-20th century, when many African nations achieved independence from colonial rule. Leaders like Traore have capitalized on widespread frustration with the perceived failures of post-colonial states, often tied to continued Western influence and economic dependency. This growing wave of nationalism seeks to address colonialism's legacies, including skewed economic structures, political instability, and social inequalities. Africa's rich natural resources have long been a focal point of international interest and exploitation. Minerals like uranium, gold, cobalt, zinc, diamonds, lithium, and copper are critical to global industries, especially technology and energy. Despite their abundance, the wealth generated from these resources has rarely benefited the local populations equitably. Instead, much of it has flowed out of the continent, enriching foreign corporations and governments. Bazi's speech highlighted this ongoing exploitation, framing it as a continuation of colonial-era resource extraction. This perspective is increasingly gaining traction among African leaders and intellectuals who argue for more control over their natural resources. They advocate for policies that ensure a greater share of the profits remain within their countries to fund development and improve living standards. The Sahel region, which includes Burkina Faso, has become a hotspot for foreign military interventions, primarily led by Western nations purportedly to combat terrorism. The presence of 10,000 foreign soldiers in the region, mostly from Western countries, has raised significant concerns among African leaders and populations. Many question the effectiveness of these foreign troops, citing the persistent insecurity and rising terrorist activities despite their presence. Bazi's speech showed what a common man in Africa thinks. The geopolitical landscape in Africa is also being reshaped by the increasing presence of non-Western powers, particularly China and Russia. China has become Africa's largest trading partner, investing heavily in infrastructure projects through its Belt and Road Initiative. These investments, often framed as partnerships, provide much-needed development, but also come with concerns about debt dependency and economic sovereignty. Russia, meanwhile, has been expanding its military and political influence, forging ties with several African nations. This includes arms deals, military training, and political support, presenting itself as a counterbalance to Western dominance. The growing influence of these non-Western powers offers African countries more options and leverage in their international relations, enabling them to negotiate better terms and diversify their partnerships. One of the most immediate implications of Bazi's speech is the potential for strengthening African unity. Bazi's address could catalyze greater solidarity among African nations by voicing common grievances and aspirations. The emphasis on historical contributions, resource wealth, and the call for cultural reclamation resonate across the continent, fostering a shared identity and purpose. This reevaluation could lead to a decline in Western influence on the continent, particularly if African leaders increasingly perceive Western policies as neo-colonial. Western nations, in turn, may need to adapt their strategies, emphasizing respect, equity, and genuine partnership. Failure to do so could result in a further erosion of their influence and the strengthening of alliances with non-Western powers like China and Russia. Do you think African leaders should take this unapologetic approach? Where will this take them? Let us know in the comments section. Will they save them from exploitation, or will it close doors? Do you want to watch more videos like this one? If so, subscribe to our channel and press the bell icon next to it. We have decided to bring videos on something nobody talks about: the Black culture, civilization, history, and evidence about how glorious Blacks have been. Thanks for watching, and until the next video, stay tuned.